So the topic that Christina assigned to me to discuss was the idea of finding research topics and trying to, I guess, bring those to completion. And I have to say, in advance, I was pretty excited to be doing this particular topic, and I was also extremely nervous about doing this particular topic. And the nervousness comes from thinking a little bit about my own personal perspective on this, which is that coming up with research topics and finishing papers has been something that's always been really difficult for me throughout my entire career. So, it's been ages now, more than 20 years, but I remember well my third year in graduate school. I had finished my exams. I had, completed my coursework, and now it was a question of trying to find a topic for a dissertation paper. And I spent the vast majority of my third year in grad school sitting in the library, reading papers and trying to come up with something. Every time I thought I had come up with what I thought was a pretty good idea, I then, reading some more papers, I realized that it looked like somebody else had done it. I'd get really discouraged. I'd go right back to the drawing board, keep reading papers, and the process continued almost for an entire year. And I think, while I read a lot, I didn't really make a whole lot of progress in terms of thinking about what I should be working on. And I mean, to be honest, this has been something that's continued on even after grad school. So coming up with new topics for papers has not always been the easiest thing for me. I think maybe it just means I'm not tremendously creative compared to other people. I go to conferences and I talk to somebody and they're telling me about the 10 other different ideas that they have. And I don't think I've ever had 10 ideas at the same time. Okay, that's just not the way I work. So it does raise a question as to, if one might wind up struggling with this, what can you actually do? And I hope to try to give you maybe a few small pointers in terms of how to approach this from using my own perspective as much as possible. But let me just give you a tiny bit of a background on myself. I found it very useful when Idawan did that, and I'll do the same thing. Okay, so just a couple minutes about myself. My degree was in economics. As I wrote on the slide here ages ago at this point, I got my PhD in 1998. I attended MIT. But from there, I immediately moved into a business school. I was in the finance department at the University of Maryland as my first job. I spent a number of years there. I moved to Arizona State University after that. I went back across the country in the US and moved to Boston University. And now I'm at UC Davis, and I've been at business schools throughout my career. And if you want to think about like what my focus of research is, my focus of research primarily is on corporate finance and banking on the theory side, not so much on the empirical side. Okay, so I'm a corporate finance and banking theorist. Okay, so let's get back to this question of how to come up with research topics, even if you feel like that might be something that doesn't come naturally and isn't very easy, right? What can you actually do? So here's some kind of broad stroke things that aren't really about what you can do precisely, but maybe about how to approach the general idea of thinking about new ideas and how to produce them. So the first thing, which kind of seems obvious and maybe almost isn't worth saying, but I think does at least bear a little bit of emphasis, is the idea that you should try to work on things that you personally find interesting, right? I wrote this on the slide and trying to introspect, like, what is it that I've noticed throughout my own career? And, I find it to be amazingly difficult generally to convince other people when you talk to them that what you're doing is important and they should care about what you're doing. And that becomes doubly so if you yourself aren't convinced about it, right? If it doesn't spark your own curiosity and you want to know what's happening here, and you don't think that this is a big idea for whatever reason, you're not going to succeed at convincing anybody else that it is. Okay, so work on things that you find interesting. And somewhat related to that is the second point, which is the idea that you shouldn't chase trends, right? And so what I mean by that is simply that, every year there seems to be a new hot topic in finance, and and in economics and in pretty much every field. And people start trying to produce a lot of papers in that field, thinking like, oh, this is hot, this might get some traction, it might ultimately get published, get cited, and so on. And that's not really necessarily true unless it's something that you think is interesting and you can sell it actually as being important, right? So don't just chase the latest trend because you feel like it's a trend, unless, of course, magically, it just happens to be that this is a topic you were working on anyways, and now there's more work to be done. And that's kind of what the trend points out to you is that there's, this is something that's actually picked up. So, but don't just kind of chase it because you feel like that's a hot topic. Make sure that you have some interest in what you're doing. And then the last sort of like overarching point here is, at the same time, while you're trying to find things that you find interesting, don't be overly concerned, at least not right away, that perhaps other people have already done the exact same thing. Okay, in all likelihood, whatever research idea you come up with, you're going to wind up having a unique perspective or unique approach on that idea. With one caveat that I'm going to get to in just a minute. There's a kind of a condition here, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, but don't get overly concerned that like all your ideas feel like they've been done. I felt like that's exactly what went wrong in my third year in grad school, which is that every thought that I had, I would then find a paper showing something quite similar, and I would find that to be very, very discouraging. Okay, and there's no definitive paper in any given field, or almost no definitive paper in almost no field, and so there's probably always additional work to be done if you think you can find a unique angle on that. Okay, so what could you be doing in practice, right? The first one is kind of obvious, but I think it's one that gets neglected sometimes, which is talk to people. One thing you just absolutely need to do, and Erdogan talked about this a little bit in his part, talking about being a new professor, is the same thing applies when you're thinking about coming up with new ideas, whether as a grad student or whether as a junior faculty member or whether as a senior faculty member, which is communicate, right? Talk to people at conferences. These conferences like the FMA is a great venue just to sit down with people, have a cup of coffee, just tell them what you're thinking about, and listen to what they're thinking about, and have some exchange of ideas. Talk to people at seminars. That's one of the biggest resources available, certainly to junior faculty. Whenever you have a speaker in, you should always be signing up to meet with that speaker. Tell them about what you're working on. Tell them about what you're thinking about working on. Ask them what else they're working on beyond the paper that was presented that day, right? So this is exactly a situation where you have the ability to exchange ideas and to talk. And it's also true of course, for PhD students, right? I go give a talk somewhere, and more often than not, there's one time slot dedicated to meeting with graduate students. And my view is, students should take every effort to sign up for that if they can, even if it's in a field somewhat outside of what you think you're interested in, right? You never know what you might learn. You don't really quite know what kind of feedback you might get on the thing that you're thinking about, coming from a slightly different perspective, and that can be useful. Certainly talk to your colleagues, talk to your advisors, talk to other students. And so, one thing that you'll probably find as you progress your career is that people's times is probably what the scarcest resource that you find, right? Like I spent a lot of my time, my first few years as an assistant professor, I would wrap up a project, send it out to people for comments, and almost never really get comments back. Nobody has time to like receive a paper that they get out of the blue. They don't know a whole lot about you. They don't know a whole lot about the paper. The likelihood that they're going to read it and send you comments back is relatively small. So when you go to conferences, when you attend seminars, when you meet in the hallways with your fellow classmates or fellow students, you almost have a little bit of a captured audience there. People are there to talk. People are there to interact. Use those opportunities for that purpose, right? That's one way of getting feedback. Maybe not the level of detail about did you get the right coefficient on your regression, or do you have the right assumption in proving your theorems and so on, but you'll get feedback on the general idea, which is exactly what you want when you're thinking about the idea of exploring a new topic, right? Discovering something. Okay, In terms of like a few practical suggestions, if I want to think about, how might I go about coming up with a new project, with a new idea, one thing that you should be thinking about is, keeping up with what's happening in the world, at least at some level, right? That doesn't mean sitting down. My brother these days is spending probably like 12 hours in front of the TV watching the news and getting freaked out by everything that's happening. That's not quite what I'm saying. But I am saying, like, keep track of what's happening in the world, whether it's financial news or otherwise, right? You probably have noticed that there are a lot of papers these days in economic and in finance on the pandemic, and they're informed. There's a little of a trend there, but they are informed by a very important event that's happened, right? 10 years ago, there were a lot of papers about the financial crisis. There continue to be papers about the financial crisis. And of course, that's very informed by important current events, and it's useful to be aware of those things. Attend sessions at conferences, right? I already mentioned you want to talk to people at conferences as much as possible, but that also means going to conferences and listening to what people are saying. What is the debate about? A lot of times sessions are created in a way that they're fairly cohesive, not always, but a lot of times dealing with one specific topic. What topics are being hotly contested? And related to that, what insight might you have on that particular topic? Is there something, do you have a fresh angle on it? Or even maybe not such a fresh angle, but some nuance that you can bring to the table? Do you have some insight that might be helpful in terms of that debate? And you can be informed a lot and rather quickly by attending sessions at conferences. And here's a really practical tip, which may seem silly, but it's the idea that if you have a thought, good or bad, write it down. Okay, make sure you put it down. I was going to say on paper. More likely means these days putting it down somewhere electronically in some format. But I remember spending years working with a co-author, and he was constantly repeating this very simple adage that if you don't write it down, it didn't happen. And mostly this was in the context of when we were working already on a paper, revising something. You may not come back to that until weeks later, and if you didn't put it down, you kind of forget what that's all about. And the exact same thing applies to ideas for projects. You sometimes have a thought, maybe based on what you hear at a conference, you don't really have that moment to explore that idea further, but you want to keep a list of these things, and then later kind of go back and think through them. And so a lot of them you'll probably just throw away because the idea that you have at 2 in the morning may not be always the best idea, but that's okay, right? You want to have a wealth of these things, and some of them may turn out to be rather important and interesting. Okay, so this raises the question of, like, you can spend a lot of time thinking about different things and topics that may come up and so on. And then you want to, at some point you have to think about, well, what are you actually going to work on? And, so what makes for a quote unquote good idea? And this is a rather hard question. And maybe this is partly relates to why I personally have struggled with coming up with research projects, which is that honestly, I don't really know what necessarily makes for a good idea. I feel like in my personal career, I've oftentimes had the hardest time publishing papers, the ones that I thought were the most interesting. And you may remember, I don't want to touch a little bit on this topic, that the profession is kind of hard, and when you're submitting papers to journals, you see papers being accepted and published that you think are much worse than the papers you're writing. And the same thing applies to your own research. So I feel like a lot of the papers that I thought were more interesting among the ones that I've written were the ones that have had a more difficult time getting through the review process. Okay, so it's not always super easy up front to judge what necessarily represents a good idea. However, the opposite might be a little bit easier. So sometimes it's a little bit easier to identify what a bad idea might be, right? And that comes back to some of the questions or the thoughts I was suggesting earlier, which is, are you answering a question that people care about, or maybe that they should care about, that they currently haven't thought about, but that they should, and can you convince them that that's something they should be thinking about? Is there some economic significance to what you're doing, or is it just curiosity? Is it a second, third order effect that you don't really think matters, but maybe it's there, maybe it's there in the data, maybe you can prove some result that shows that something, some effect is there, but is it really first order, and is it explaining something, right? And I think sometimes applying those criteria may allow you to quickly figure out, maybe this is not necessarily a great idea. It won't tell you that it's necessarily a good one, but it might tell you that maybe it's not the best one, okay? And this kind of ties into a little bit like how you should approach your own evaluation of literature. You spend a lot of time reading papers in grad school. You spend a lot of time reading papers as an assistant professor. You spend a lot of time reading papers, throughout your career, whether it's reviewing papers or for conferences, for journals, or whatever it happens to be. And, we're kind of trained as social scientists to be critical and to try to identify flaws, and in our own research to correct those flaws. But I think you don't want to approach the reading of papers in a way that says, okay, let me only identify what is the problem with this paper, and then use that to simply discard the content here, right? You want to think about when you're reading a paper, particularly if it's a published paper, there has to be something there that people thought was interesting and unique and they gave a perspective. What is it? What can you actually learn from this paper? And how might that help you when you're thinking about the projects that you want to work on and the papers that you want to write? Okay, so it's okay to be critical, but it's also useful to think about what is it that you're learning from the literature that you're reading, and that probably you're spending a lot of time reading. Okay, let me give you a little bit of an anecdote. This isn't from myself, but it's actually from a preliminary job talk that I attended many years ago. And I won't say who it was because I don't want to out to that particular person. But in the talk, again, this was somebody preparing for the job market and did an internal talk, and it was a very relatively low key, but it's a stressful event for the student. And the student had a table similar to this one. And what they went through was they had a series of different think about like features or issues that could be studied within one particular literature. And so I list here 5 different items, right? And what the student had done was catalog, what different combinations of these items have been done. So what they had found is that, item 1 and item 2 had been looked at in paper X. And item 2 combined with item 4 had been looked at in paper Z by these authors, right? And item 5 with item 4 had been done in some other paper. And so that's what shows up on the boxes. And lo and behold, what they had found was that the combination of items 3 and 5 had never been done. And so they were writing this paper to kind of fill in that box and then complete all the possible combinations that could be done, right? And I remember my reaction during that seminar, which was, that's just a terrible motivation for why you're writing this paper. It might be that that's how you came up with the idea, that you had this realization that like, nobody's looked at that combination, and so it bears looking at. But don't try to pitch me the paper as this is why you're writing the paper, right? It might be that combination, it might be that everything else has been done because those have been the easier things to do. And the holy grail might be, in this example, items 3 and 5, but nobody's been able to do that. But that's what people have wanted to do. Okay, that's a perfectly fine way of thinking about why you might want to work on a paper. That this is the answer you want to do. You'd like to combine items 3 and 5. Everybody would like to do that. They've never been able to do it, so you have a lot of results around the edges, and you've come up with a way of doing it. Okay, that's okay, but just saying we're exhausting the set of different possible combinations of things that can be done, and that's my motivation for writing this paper, is not really something that screams, oh, this is an important issue that has to be tackled, and it's something that even I should care about and be curious about. Okay, so think a little bit about why you actually want to write this paper. And it kind of comes back to a little bit to what I said before, is work on things that you find interesting, because that'll help you convince other people that they should be interested as well. Okay, so, all right, so let's say you have an idea, right? Whatever it happens to be, you've come up with something, and you think that something is interesting, you're curious about it, you suspect it might be important. What should you do at this point? Here's my personal advice, and it's based on advice I myself received in grad school. And I think it's something that's worked reasonably well for me. So And it sounds simple, but it sometimes takes a tiny bit of discipline and introspection to do this. Okay, so my idea is once you have an idea, work on it for a little while. Okay, so what does a little while mean? I'll come back to that in just a second, but what I have in mind is that you spend enough time on this idea, whatever it is, such that you understand it reasonably well, and you have a sense of as to what you might be able to do. So if this is related to data, if it's an empirical project that you're interested in, consider what's the exact question you want to ask. Like understanding the effect of taxes on capital structure isn't really a question, right? That's like 5 chapters in a corporate finance book. So you need to think about what is the exact question that you have in mind, and then try to think further. Like, how would you do it? If you have this question, how would you try to answer this question? What data is available to you to answer that question? If you're doing theory and you're interested in that, try sketching a model. Once you've defined your question, try sketching a model and deriving at least some preliminary implications. You don't have to have everything figured out, but you should kind of get your hands dirty a little bit, work with either the data or the equations and the theory, and get some preliminary results. Okay, after you've done this, after you've worked on this for a little while, that could be 2 weeks. I put 2 weeks here because I remember that exactly one of my advisors using 2 weeks as his example as how long to work on something. At that point, you may want to think about researching the literature more carefully, right? What have others done? How have they done it? What limitations did they encounter in trying to answer a similar question? And here's the important part, right? And this kind of comes back to my point at the very beginning where I said, don't worry too much about the fact that maybe some of the ideas that you have been done already. And it's this last point here, which is, what is it that you were doing in the 2 weeks or whatever time you've already spent on this? What is that? How is that different from what other people have done? And how might that difference help overcome the limitations, in other words, right? So whenever you work on something yourself and you understand it, and you get your hands dirty with working with the data, working the theory, whatever it is, you're going to develop your own unique perspective on it. It's unlikely going to be that the way you're approaching the problem is exactly the same as how somebody else has approached the problem. And the fact that there's heterogeneity there, that you're doing it differently, it may help overcome some of the limitations of some of the existing work. Now, of course, it may be that it doesn't, right? It may be that, like, at the end, the answers you're getting, you discover are exactly the same as what somebody else has done. And that's okay. You've learned something about a topic. You've really understood it probably much better than you would have just by reading a few papers. And maybe it's time to move on. And you've only invested a couple of weeks in it, and you can think of something else, right? But the likelihood is that your perspective will be unique once you spend a little bit of time in actually trying to do it, right? And then this becomes a point at which you may want to, go back to one of my other suggestions, which is that this is the point to start talking to people about it, right? Like, and it's not just about getting suggestions for how to improve it, but also to get a general sounding board for, is this idea one that, other people might find interesting, and that you can motivate them to think further of this question. Okay, so what about writing the actual paper, right? So part of it is finding the right research topic, and the other one is kind of completing it and getting something done, right? So here's something that I largely ignored early in my career, and I think it haunted me a little bit, and now hopefully I've gotten a little bit better at this, which is that this idea that whether you want to call it motivating what you're working on, whether you want to call it pitching your idea, whether you want to talk about framing the paper, whatever you want to call this aspect of writing papers is as important, if maybe not more, than your actual analysis. Okay, I remember coming out of grad school, I had this idea that my introduction for the paper wasn't particularly important because the body of the paper spoke for itself, right? And if you talk to anybody You know, as an assistant professor, you talk to anybody more senior in the profession, they'll tell you absolutely that's not true. It's almost impossible to get readers past the introduction if they're not sufficiently interested in the introduction. Yuri talked about the idea of using a hook in teaching to get students interested. You need the kind of the same thing in terms of motivating or pitching the paper. You need something that gets people interested and wanting to continue to read the rest of your results. Okay, so that's an important part of writing a paper. But in doing all of this, you want to keep in mind that, you know, there's no such thing as a perfect paper, right? All papers are imperfect. All empirical analyses are flawed. All models are incomplete. They're abstractions of reality, right? So the main question for yourself in writing your papers, which is what I also suggest you apply when you think about reading papers, is, you know, is something being learned from the analysis? Okay, and if it is, that's something that's worth doing. You don't need a grand unifying theory, right? Like the way that they're looking for in physics. But what you are doing should be interesting, you know, or at least mildly interesting to other people more than yourself, right? And a corollary to this is you're never going to write a paper that's liked by everyone, or almost never going to write a paper that, you know, well, put it differently, almost no one will write a paper that's universally liked, right? So especially as a student, if you're thinking about ultimately you're going to face the test of having to go on the job market and look for a job, your goal really is to write a paper that hopefully no one hates, but that there's at least a critical mass of people that like that paper, right? So I don't want to talk about this in the context of getting tenure. You need a body of work that can be evaluated by external reviewers, so you want to be known for something. And kind of the same principle applies at the level of an individual paper. You need to have some people that are sufficiently interested that they're going to say, yes, this is a great idea, whether on the reviewing side, when you send it to a journal, or even on the job market side, when you need somebody to be advocating for why they should hire this particular person, right? So there needs to be a critical mass of people that like it, and hopefully you haven't insulted too many people and nobody hates it. Okay, so the bottom line, I know I'm out of time. Start writing, right? Whatever you do, you just need to, you need to get your hands dirty, start writing papers, let your curiosity guide you, get your hands dirty, as I said, with some of the analysis. But at the same time, don't worry too much about sunk costs, right? So don't be afraid to pull the plug and start over. Hopefully you can do that after only a little bit of work, rather than 2 years into a project and realize everything is flawed or everything's been done before. But starting over is a normal part of the process. Okay, that's all I have.